So the image behind is an image of Barabashova market. It's 75 hectares. It's the 14th largest market in the world and the largest market in eastern Ukraine. If you go to Kharkiv, where it's located, people in Kharkiv will insist that it's also the largest market in Ukraine. I would recommend that you just agree with them, even though actually the largest market in Ukraine is in Odessa. It's not an argument you're going to win or worth fighting. Barabashova is, however, pretty central to Kharkiv's understanding of itself as a trading city and to other peoples around the world's understanding of Kharkiv. My friends were telling me that when the full-scale invasion began and concerned Chinese citizens sent aid, they wrote to Barabashova city because that's how they understood, that's how they remembered, I suppose, their travels perhaps, or their interpretations of Kharkiv. Also, for reasons more to do with location, and luckily, because Barabashova is so large, I can say this without putting myself at any security risk, it's pretty central to my understanding, because I live close by to it, so I often drive back past there on my way home, because I spend 50% of my time in Kharkiv, including now. And that's what it looks like now, unfortunately. Perhaps not necessarily surprisingly, although parts of it are coming back. But Kharkiv is more than that. Kharkiv is also, certainly to me, or in my opinion, the city that proves the lie, or the city that Russian propaganda about itself, about Ukraine, about the world, about people. Kharkiv is the city where all of that comes to die. And it's been that way since 2014. We can think back to Kharkiv's impeccably pro-Russian mayor, Kernez, who owned basically all of the media, and paid all of the journalists a lot more than they would be paid to work for other media. And yet, despite that, in 2014, when you have the anti-Maidan protests, and there were plenty of people who didn't like the Maidan in Kharkiv, that wasn't the issue, they really struggled to find any grassroots support. They had to bus in people, just like in 2004, from Kursk or from neighboring Belgorod. This is why we have this plaque in central Kharkiv. Again, obviously, the city's going through a tough time. In this place, on the night of the 15th of March 2014, there was a battle between patriots of Ukraine and pro-Russian militants. Kharkiv showed that it is a Ukrainian city. Obviously, Kharkiv continues to show that it is a Ukrainian city, and yet the Russians, in general, continued to not listen. They also didn't listen after 2014, which is why, after their first hits, the Russian elite divisions, the parachutists, just thought they could drive through the city in armoured vehicles. In particular, Tiger armoured vehicles. They drove through expecting no resistance until they were hit by Grad missiles. Then, of course, they suspected something might be up, and they hid in this school. And according to my friends, who were part of the team who led to the specialist Russians' demise, they fought really bravely. They didn't surrender, and that's why their bodies are actually still there in this school number 136. And the school has a very, for those who speak German, they'll understand, or of course, for those who speak Ukrainian, says success in studying means success in life. That's not, unfortunately, a maxim, well, yeah, unfortunately, it's not a maxim that can be applied to Russians' attitudes towards Ukraine. But funnily enough, I don't want to talk about Kharkiv. Well, I do want to talk about Kharkiv a bit, which is why I've started this way. But I don't want to talk about Kharkiv entirely today. As for one reason, and that's because I don't think that anybody in this room probably believes Russian views on Ukraine or Russia's ideological understanding of Ukraine as a construct created to destroy Russia. And it's very easy to see the flaws in Russian thinking. It's very easy to see the flaws in people who don't think like us because it's more natural. Instead, I want to look at some of the flaws in our own thinking, our being a kind of liberal, Euro-Atlantic, I suppose, cultural, political context. And I think we see that most clearly when we talk about Russian liberals. Now, the Russian invasion was catastrophic for all involved, not least for the men still lying in that building. But it's a long time in the making. Putin's been in power for 24 years, and his evolution from the guy who was the first to call George W. Bush after 9/11, from broadly somebody with democratic, yet very autocratic at the same time tendencies and great power sympathies to what he is today, it reflected and reinforced a national journey. The Democrats' great power distinction is a simplification, but it is one that can be used with some justification for the 1990s and the early 2000s. Since then, Russian society and foreign policy and the worldview that informs it have changed dramatically. Russian liberals are not to blame for that, but they did lose the argument, and they're still losing it. And I think it's important to understand the different reasons why, because the contexts, of course, differ radically, but I think it holds lessons for us in the West, and also in some of the ways we continue to misunderstand Russia, a failing that I perceive as being grounded in our own post-Cold War ideological biases. So first of all, definitions. Who are the Russian liberals we're talking about? For the purpose of this, we're talking about people in Russia who believe in basic kind of political and human rights and freedoms, in the freedom of speech, in redressing at least some historical wrongs, who are not nostalgic for the USSR, and who are anti-war. And this is an important point because you have a number of people with socially liberal values who we can describe as co-opted liberals insofar as they are acquiescent to the war and supportive of Putin. And we'll also maybe talk about them as anti-imperialist to a point. We can think of the images of the Muscovites who protested in the dying days of the Soviet Union in support of Baltic independence. But not all were. I think probably the helpful quote here from Boris Yeltsin: Russia reserves the right to raise the question of border revision should any newly independent Soviet republic, excluding the Baltics, refuse allied relations secured by an appropriate treaty. You could also sum it up with the frequently used, increasingly frequently used Ukrainian phrase that the Russian liberal ends where Ukraine's borders start. And what that means is that the Russian understanding of Ukrainian independence and sovereignty is conditional, and it's always been conditional. That's a big debate. We can maybe get into that in the Q&A if anybody's particularly interested. But the point, the relevance to the definition is that there is, at least to a certain extent, an anti-imperialism, but a slight blind spot sometimes on Ukraine. So, and the reason why I wouldn't overstate it is because irredentism towards Ukraine, it's flared up over the years. There's some wonderful histories on this. But it was never really, there was no, for example, massive public demand to annex Crimea. Crimea was annexed and then people loved it. But there was no massive demand for that beforehand. And so we can't just explain this through, oh, Russians are imperialists, that's that. I think a bigger problem for the social liberals or the political liberals has been that they were let down, of course, by Russia's experience of economic liberalism. And to be fair, the 90s were pretty awful in Russia. You have, between 1991 and 1997, the economy contracts almost 50%. In January 1992, hyperinflation reaches a monthly rate of 245.3%. Not many people are getting paid their salaries. Almost nobody's getting paid them on time. And crime is through the roof. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Soviet nostalgia also starts to go through the roof. Okay, so perhaps then the issue of the failure lies in the 90s. But again, if we look over the border, we see Ukraine has it even worse. Ukraine's GDP dropped 60%. It has inflation of over 10,000%. Nobody in Ukraine, apart from perhaps Akhmetov, is getting paid his salary. And the crime is also pretty grim. So the 90s aren't quite enough either. What's more, Ukraine had no support, very little intellectual support of the type that Western intellectuals gave towards Russia's democratic transition, and any economic help, which was provided in proportionally much lesser amounts, was often based on demilitarization and, of course, denuclearization in a way that would lend itself very well to a narrative of national humiliation, should Ukraine have been so inclined. And my point here is that you can't just use the historical determinism, nor, of course, can we lurch the other way towards a cultural determinism. Oh, well, Russians are just illiberal. Russians are just anti-liberal. Well, no, because then what do we mean by that? Do we mean Russians who are ethnic Russians, Russians who are brought up in a cultural understanding of what Russia is? Okay, but that's true, actually, for most of the ethnic Russians, such as that is a thing, who live in Kharkiv. It's true for my friend who was born in Russia, very much, who studied, then taught Russian literature, but happened to move to Kharkiv when she was 12 and now is married to a Ukrainian serviceman and frequently risks her life on a day-to-day basis. So clearly that's not that helpful an explanation either, especially because if we start to look at it, really Ukrainian versus Russian values, when we go beyond the sort of national areas, they're not radically that different. So instead, I would argue that an important part, certainly not the only one, but an important part of the difference lies not so much in these values or determinism, but rather in the different ways that history has been applied in the different cultures, in the different nations, and how successfully it's been able to be tied into a vision of national identity. We humans are storytellers, and the more resonance and sense that a story makes, the more likely we are to believe it, to make it our own. The resonance, in turn, is of course informed by strategic culture, by popular culture, by the things we learn at school, by the things our parents tell us. But of course, history can be told in different ways. Different meanings can be elicited, and different events can be remembered or, of course, forgotten. And that's how we start to see something a bit more interesting when we look at Russia versus Ukraine. Do you now regret the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991? We start from a position that's not so radically different, but of course, very different tendencies. Perhaps even more stark is Russian versus Ukrainians' positive attitude towards Stalin. So some pretty different views going on there. And we see that Russia and Ukraine are telling different stories. And the problem of the Russian liberals, I would argue, wasn't so much the 90s, it was more in part that they lost control of the narrative about why the 90s was as it was. They lost control of a narrative of history and therefore of the future. Essentially, they failed to tell a story that people recognized, believed in, and also wanted to believe in. By contrast, the people who we might call the great powerists, they did have, in Russia, they did have a story, and their story of the 90s was as something imposed, alien, as further evidence of the West trying to destroy Russia, just as it had destroyed the Soviet Union, a story of the 1990s as evidence of the West and of the Western way of civilization as inherently alien and even harmful to Russia. And of course, of the West as an enemy. And this is something that we can trace also in strategic military thought. Dmitry Minich has produced a wonderful study. I think he's only in French at the moment, but he shows how the thinking of the Russian, I suppose, top military brass changes in terms of their understanding of war and how this is very closely linked to their understanding of what happened in 1991. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? And their understanding that the Soviet Union collapsed because the West destroyed it, using a hybrid, novel form of warfare that Russia would need to get pretty good at if it didn't want to be destroyed again. So it ties into, of course, negative elements, but also into positive elements, back into the idea of Russia as a great power that can then get back up off its knees, this common phrase. And so it ties into the sorts of fears that we see here. And I won't go through this because I'm running out of time, but I'll just leave it there because I think it's interesting if you start to think about the fact that return to repressions is a greater fear in 1994 than it is in 2022. And these fears can be used, worked on in different ways. Now, there's an elephant in the room, which is that of platform. Of course, there's a huge authoritarian tendency across Putin's rule. And yet, if we look back to 2011, before the conservative turn, we can see that already Russian liberal messaging was not resonating. So, for example, Yabloko, the Liberal Party, was getting 1% in elections, or 1% of intended votes. Novaya Gazeta, the liberal excellent paper, had 1/25 of the subscribers that Arguments and Facts did, a much more great powerist line. And Dozhd, the television channel, which was launched in 2008 with the then Russian president being there on screen for its launch, had less than 1% of viewers as compared to, let's say, for example, the quite niche Russian culture channel, which had 6%. So we already see that it's failing. After 2012, it only gets worse in long part, yes, because of autocratic tendencies, but also because of illiberal approaches that are very much taken and often inspired by media manipulation tactics used in liberal societies. So again, we can't just reduce it to a dictatorship democracy element. After 2022, clearly the situation has got even worse, although you can still access media on Telegram and YouTube. And the dilemmas faced by the Russian liberals have, of course, become even worse. They're considerably worse because they're in exile, they're cut off from their own society. Their association with the West won't do them many favors, to put it mildly. They don't have so much influence, especially if we compare it with, let's say, the patriotic policy critics, the nationalists and Slavophiles, who are often critical of the elites, but ultimately support the war. They just don't like the way it's done. At the same time, Russian society is shifting. We see a decreasing number of liberals, social liberals, who are against the war. They're becoming older. We see an increasing number of co-opted liberals, the sort of Gazprom princesses that you might meet in the West. And there's no real narrative or coherence in the way, both at home or abroad, of what a different vision of Russia might look like. And yet, despite all of this, we continue to see the Russian liberal opposition in the West treated as if that is the inevitable, or, at very best, as if this is still a divide between between the Democrats and the great powerists. But that was already a flawed division back then, and I think that ultimately, whilst I can understand why we in the West want to believe that ultimately Russians are just waiting to get rid of Putin, waiting, for them to come to power, and they are, secretly very popular because it fits our worldview. Just like Putin wanted to believe that Ukraine would see the arrival of Russian Tiger armored vehicles as a liberation, and just like he spent money on this that then needed to be justified, we're in the same position. And I think that ultimately there are many lessons for us here, but one of the key ones is that if we don't listen to what the societies are telling us, if we instead insist on seeing this through our own ideological or perhaps even teleological sense of this is the best way of organizing a society, we believe that and therefore everybody else will believe it, well, if we don't listen to people and we don't take our arguments and make a better defense of them on the marketplace of ideas, we shouldn't be surprised if in the end people stop buying those ideas. I think that's what happened to the Russian liberals. And what worries me more is, in small parts, I worry that that's what could happen to liberal ideas, not just in Russia. Thank you.